Woohoo!
So, one of the things that comes up on my newsfeed a lot that I find particularly annoying are the never-ending stream of articles saying something along the lines of, "Ooh, we have no idea about the mystery of consciousness." I think that the reason that I find those articles particularly annoying is they never talk about what consciousness is. They just act like everyone knows there's this monolithic, special, magical human thing called consciousness.
Yeah.
And they never even talk about what that even means. And there is no such thing as the state of consciousness. Like, we have lots of different states as human beings, and processes, and feelings. And some of them we describe as conscious, some of them as unconscious, right? So, what I want to do is I want to do a series.
Okay.
On breaking down consciousness. Let's actually go after this, like, almost from a literary perspective.
Okay.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So let's demystify this a little bit. Let's figure out what we're talking about. And of course, to some degree, this ties into the question of artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
Right? And whether there is this thing, consciousness, that we need to strive, that we particularly need to strive for. So to begin our series of breaking down consciousness into its constituent components, I want to start with something that seems most basic, and that is our sensory perceptions. Taking a closer look at our senses and how they relate to consciousness.
Okay.
First sense that we have, we see things. What does sight feel like?
Sight feels like my sort of primary perception of the world, in a way. Because when I think of what something is, like, first and foremost, I usually think of what it looks like. Sight's sort of like the foundation for what I think of as reality.
Yeah, I think that's all true. Now describe it for me. What's it feel like to see something?
I don't know.
Hard to say even.
Yeah.
Right? We all sit here and pontificate about consciousness. Can't really describe what sight feels like. Well, let's maybe break it down a little bit and begin to describe it to some degree. How is sight different than our other senses?
It can be sort of immediately blocked off when you close your eyes. All the other senses aren't really things that you can just shut off like that. And that's why there's like the sort of like these unpleasant emotion associated with a lot of them for like things like, oh, if it's like a gross food you're eating, an unpleasant sensation, like a really bad sound to hear. But with sight, obviously there's the bright light that you try hard to avoid even when you close your eyes. But for the most part, you can just shut your eyes and be done with it.
Yeah, so we don't have to go into massive detail on each of these,
yeah.
Right? But I think that's a good one. That it's something that we feel like we can turn on and off. It's kind of weird.
Yeah.
What about the distances at which it operates?
There's a whole field of like eye science where like sometimes like you can be nearsighted or farsighted where you can only see things at a certain thing. But like if you have healthy vision, you're able to comprehend the world where you can both see things that are near and far, but also sort of estimate exactly how far away they are.
So you talked about that it operates at both a close proximity to us and a distant proximity to us. How far away can we see things?
Miles away.
Miles? Further than that even, or not?
Well, it's hard to estimate exactly how far we can see because generally there's things in like blocking our sight. you don't normally get like just a straight view to the end of the world, you know? But like if we look out at the ocean, we can see like pretty far away.
That would be miles.
Miles.
Right? But
Yeah.
is that the furthest? So if we look out over the ocean, we can see miles.
Yeah.
Ever seen a star?
Yeah. Pretty far away.
Right? Like billions of miles.
Yeah.
Almost infinite distances. And closeness, you know. So very unusual. Can't do that with any other sense.
No.
Is sight omnidirectional or unidirectional?
Unidirectional.
Try it again. Is sight... Oh, did you say unidirectional?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Dave.
Sight is unidirectional because it's your eyes. You can see things out of like your peripheral vision, like there's sort of like the corner of your eye, but your eyes are just like on one side of your face, and so you can't see behind you. You don't have eyes on the back of your head because this is just sort of, it's very direct, and like you can control exactly what you're looking at, which isn't something that happens for like hearing. You can hear things from sort of all around you, but for sight, it's kind of limited in what exactly you're looking at, and you're really able to control it.
Well, yeah, and it's also limited in terms of closeness and farness.
Yeah.
You focus,
Yeah.
right? Like you can focus on something near, and then that far stuff becomes blurry.
Yeah. It's the sort of effect that the camera creates sometimes when it's like the background blurs out of focus, but it's like that's based on our eye. Like that's just something that naturally happens when you're looking at the background. When I'm looking at this wall right here, the cameras fade out my vision, but now when I'm looking at the cameras, everything else seems blurry.
Right, and that's literally a function of a lens.
Yeah.
Right?
In our eye.
Yeah, exactly. They're just lenses. What about the amount of information you get through your visual processing versus other senses? High bandwidth or low bandwidth?
I'd say pretty high bandwidth because we can see a lot of things at once. I think that we naturally focus on one thing and our brains sort of think about one thing, but just in terms of what we're actually seeing, like I'm seeing like hundreds of just individual little details right now, and like I'm seeing the ocean move, I'm seeing like this one ant that's crawling move, I'm seeing like a lot of movement is going on where it's like things are constantly changing and we're still able to keep up with it.
Do you think there's any relationship between the unidirectional nature of eyesight and its high bandwidth?
I'd say so, yeah, because the amount of information that we're able to process right now is limited by just where the eyes are, where they're focusing. And if we had eyes and like on the back of our head, or even like in more places than that, like if we had like 100 eyes, then we'd hardly be able to process any of the information because it's coming at us. There's just so much of it. So in a weird way, if we had more eyes, we'd actually be a little bit more limited in our perception.
Well, and I think that's an important thing to remember about our brains, is they only have so much processing power. Nature is extremely careful about using that processing power. And so as beneficial and as high bandwidth as eyesight is, it only allows you to see a small focus area because otherwise the information would just be too much to process.
Yeah.
Interesting, though. We don't really think about that.
No.
Is all sight conscious?
No.
Give me some examples of unconscious sight.
Well, just some things that like fade into our background are still things that we're seeing if we're not quite processing them. But also, when I'm zoned out of something and I'm totally in my own head and something's still going on in front of me, that's not really like, I'm not really consciously looking at something or viewing something, but I'm still processing it. And so if something like sudden happens in my vision, then I might like cue back into the scene.
Well, so you described two different things there. One is your peripheral vision.
Yeah.
Right? Which is largely unconscious. We're monitoring it.
Yeah.
Like, we're not aware of what's going on there at this point, right? It's not conscious to me. And the second thing you talked about was daydreaming, right? Where you can kind of just be lost in your own thoughts and your eyes are open. And if someone asked you kind of what you were looking at, you almost wouldn't even be able to say.
Yeah.
Let me throw out something that's similar to that. What does it feel like to read?
Oh, reading's a weird one because there's like certain levels to it. Because people say that like imagination is like the whole experience. You kind of like go into the world in your head, and that's true. But it's like when you're reading the words on a page, if it's like something boring, something you're not interested in, or something that's just not really like in a narrative way, like if you're reading a textbook, then you're going to be looking at that information, looking at like words on paper, and you're going to be like processing that information in your brain. So you're not exactly seeing the words, but instead sort of like getting their meaning like gone into your mind.
When you are reading,
Yeah.
where is your consciousness? Is it on what you're seeing, or is it someplace else?
You're looking at the words and just like at what they are, just like ink on paper, or if you're reading something on your computer, then like pixels. But when you're looking at it, you're not really consciously processing like the shapes that the letters are or anything in the way that you look at like an image or like the world around you. You're sort of you're unconsciously or subconsciously looking at the letters, but that's sort of like the meaning is going into your brain. Instead of like the letters, the words themselves, it's sort of like the automatic conditioned meaning of the words goes in your brain. It's like, you know how they say you can't look at something, you can't look at letters without reading them? Like even if you try not to, you just automatically do it. That's sort of what's going on there, because you're conditioned into not looking at the letters as what they are, but instead as sort of like a code that means, oh, this is this.
Is it possible when you're reading like a novel that you actually see something other than the words?
Yeah, when you're reading like a narrative piece, then I've heard people describe it in different ways. For me, it's not really like I'm seeing something else. Like my eyes aren't, obviously they're still focused on the words, I'm still reading them, but it's like sort of a next level daydreaming experience where you're sort of subconsciously like looking at what you're viewing, but then like in your mind you're consciously focused on something else. And that's not necessarily like, I've heard some people describe it as a movie in your head. I think that's sort of like a limited way of looking at it, because it's not really anything like a movie. It's sort of on a different level than that, because you're not seeing.
Well, and just to kind of define that a little bit, if someone's reading a story about a character and they're like, oh my gosh, like it's creating this movie in my head, ask them what color the pants are then.
No, exactly.
like you know, it's not there.
Half the time when you're reading something, you won't even be focused on like the character, like what they look like their hair color, their eye color, or anything like that. You won't be able, if it's like a fight scene or something, you're not going to be able to choreograph the movements perfectly. You might not even know exactly what's going on, if it's depending on whether it's confusing or not. But it's sort of the experience of reading something hard to describe, just like in the same way that it's hard to describe what sight actually is. It's just sort of your imagination taking over and you sort of creating some details in your head of what's going on in the scene.
But on some level, I think we'd both agree that reading is unconscious seeing.
Yeah.
Because your consciousness is someplace else.
Definitely.
So let's talk about maybe a kind of seeing that happens when you're totally unconscious. What about dreams?
Yeah, dreams are hard to talk about because they're sort of naturally like nonsensical.
But are they visual?
They are visual. Yeah. Yeah, dreams are very visual in sort of a strange way because of like their nonsensical nature. What you're seeing isn't quite matched up to your other senses, or it'll be like a blur of shapes and colors instead of anything that actually does it. So dreams are strange in a way because you're still seeing things, but they're not really your perception of reality, because there's no like real reality in like your dream world.
Well, just a second. So you're saying you're seeing, but without your eyes?
Yeah, in your brain.
Right? I mean, it's interesting.
Yeah.
And you're unconscious at that moment. Maybe that's seeing.
Yeah, I guess.
Or maybe that counts as seeing. I don't even know.
Dreams, I feel like it wouldn't exactly count as seeing, because if seeing was like perceiving through your eyes, because like that's how you describe sight. It's like that's your eye sense. Dreaming is more like an extended hallucination, where like your brain is recreating things that you've seen with your eyes in reality. Like, you know, they say that you can never create like a new face in your dreams, but it's it's sort of like really a good example of obviously unconscious seeing, or like daydreaming, dreaming, because in your head, your eyes aren't actually perceiving anything, but your brain is still kind of delivering the message that your eyes bring to it without the first part, because your brain's basically just making it all up.
Would you say that then, and this isn't the same for all of our senses, would you say that sight is more often conscious or more often unconscious? Like if you're awake and you have your eyes open, do you know what I mean?
I would say that it would differ between the person and what kind of like things that they're actually doing. But for me, a lot of times sight is unconscious. I think in terms of the other senses, seeing is definitely more conscious than them. It's like I said, it's like your main perception of the world. Seeing is like you're never not doing it.
Well, yeah, and I would say that it's it's very hard to not consciously see something. Like if your eyes are open, you're looking.
Yeah.
Like, you know what I mean? Like it's arresting to an individual. And that's not necessarily the case for all the senses. So as we try to understand seeing things from a consciousness perspective, I think it's illustrative to go from one perspective to another. So what does it feel like to go from unconscious seeing to conscious seeing? It's
like you're tuning back into the world.
Can you give me an example?
Yeah, like if you've been like reading and then you suddenly like look around you, then it's sort of a shock almost for just for a second, because all of a sudden you're transferring like where you are in your head from like inside of it to like outside of it, and you're perceiving on a level that you weren't before, on a conscious level. And so you're almost more in tune with the world than you were before. That shift is what you're mentally processing at that point. Yeah. Right? When you're reading, you're mentally processing the meaning, and all of a sudden you look up, and it's not like there's that meaning anymore. No. Right? You're just processing the signals. And the adjustment is hard, like when we're going from like conscious to unconscious when you're reading. A lot of times, like for the first few seconds or even the first few minutes, when you're reading a story, you're not really in that unconscious state yet. So you're almost like, you're still processing the meaning behind the words, but like for like a narrative sense, you're not in that like daydreaming zone yet. Yeah, it takes a little while to get that ramped up. So when you think of seeing in consciousness, in conscious seeing, is there anything that seems particularly magical about that? I mean, in a way, yeah. Like, I feel like everything that like we do and everything in the world kind of becomes magical when you think about it too hard, because it's like, what are we doing with our eyes? You know, like we're able to look at the world, we're able to like, you know, like we're able to perceive the world in a way, like a million different like little movements in the back of my head, and it's so cool. Like, is there something that can't be explained by physical processes going on? Do you think? Does it feel that way? The normal part of seeing, where it's like you're the conscious, like fully focused part of seeing, where you're looking at something and that gets delivered to your brain, and you're like, okay, I'm processing this thing, this is what's going on, this is my perception of the world around me. That's all very normal. But when we're getting into things like daydreaming or reading or dreaming, then it's like, what's going on? Because we're seeing things that aren't there, and we're not seeing things that are there, and it's like, what's going on in our heads and our eyes isn't quite matching up. Well, but let me challenge that a little bit, right? So let's begin to talk about consciousness a little bit, right? So it seems like consciousness is something about focusing or processing on a particular input. Yeah. So if that's really what we're doing here, like we have functions, like we have all this information coming in through all these senses, right? And then consciousness is a subroutine, if we will, that moves around and takes in different information because it's more relevant at that point. Yeah. Like, wouldn't it kind of feel exactly like what you just described? Like sometimes you're mentally processing something internal and whatever else, so the visual stuff almost kind of turns off from that processing, right? Other times you're actually fully engaged. Like, does any of that seem particularly mysterious? No, I guess not. In other words, you can almost imagine like that's just what it feels like to focus on a particular set of information and to process a particular set of information. Well, dreams are kind of messed up, but that other stuff for sure. We hope that you enjoyed that video, and if you did, please consider checking out the next one in the series.
Or some of our other series on philosophy and life.
We upload videos every Friday, so don't forget to like and subscribe.
Like and subscribe. See you next week.